You think you know Louis XIV, the Sun King, the guy who built Versailles and said, "I am the state." But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Louis XIV didn't just build the most extravagant palace in Europe. He built the most elaborate prison system ever designed, and then he locked himself inside it. For 72 years, Louis XIV ruled France. 72 years. That's longer than most people live, much less reign as an absolute monarch. He outlived his son, his grandson, and most of his great-grandchildren. By 1715, the man who had danced at balls and led armies was 76 years old, surrounded by a court system so rigid, so utterly controlled, that even his own death would have to follow protocol. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a machine. Every morning, the lever, the rising ceremony, would begin at exactly 8:30. Courtiers would file into the king's bedroom in strict hierarchical order. The highest-ranking nobles got to hand Louis his shirt. Lesser nobles got to watch. Everyone had a role, everyone had a place. And the king was the center of it all, performing his life like a theatrical production where the curtain never fell. Think about that for a moment. Louis XIV couldn't even get dressed in private. His meals were public spectacles where hundreds of courtiers would watch him eat. His conversations were overheard by dozens of eavesdroppers. His walks in the gardens were attended by entourages. Even his trips to the bathroom, yes, his actual bodily functions, were witnessed by select courtiers who considered it an honor to be present. This wasn't accidental. Louis had designed it this way. By making every moment of royal life a public ritual, he kept the French nobility exactly where he wanted them. At Versailles, under his eye, competing for his favor instead of plotting in their provincial estates. It was brilliant. It was suffocating. And it worked for decades. But here's the thing about machines. They don't care about the humanity of their operators. The system Louis created demanded that he perform the role of king every single moment of every single day. No weakness, no privacy, no rest. For over 7 decades, Louis XIV had been the Sun King, and the sun doesn't get to set just because it's tired. By August 1715, Louis had been performing this role for so long that he'd forgotten there was a difference between the king and the man. His court included roughly 10,000 people living at Versailles, all watching him, all depending on the elaborate rituals that structured their lives. The Duke of Saint-Simon, one of those courtiers, kept detailed memoirs of everything he witnessed. The Marquis de Dangeau kept a daily journal. These men documented the machine of Versailles in obsessive detail, and what they were about to witness would reveal just how cruel that machine could be. Because in August 1715, something went wrong with the center of the machine. The king's body began to fail, and the system Louis had created, it wouldn't let him fail in private. On August 10, 1715, King Louis XIV went hunting. This wasn't unusual. Despite his age, Louis still maintained the public rituals expected of a French king, and hunting was one of them. But something was different this time. When he returned to Versailles, he was limping. A pain in his left leg that he initially dismissed as nothing serious, just old age, just fatigue. He was 76 years old. A little pain was to be expected. Guy Crescent Fagan had been Louis's primary physician since 1693. He was 77 years old himself, trained in the old medical traditions of humoral theory and bloodletting. When Louis mentioned the pain in his leg, Fagan did what any respectable 17th-century physician would do. He ordered bloodletting and purges, because in 1715, doctors believed that most illnesses came from imbalances in the body's fluids, and the solution was always the same. Remove the bad blood, purge the system, restore balance. It didn't work. By August 13th, Louis was walking with visible difficulty. Court observers noted it in their journals. The king, who had always moved with grace and authority, was now leaning on furniture as he walked through the halls of Versailles. But the lever still happened. The couture, the evening putting-to-bed ceremony, still took place on schedule. The machine of Versailles kept running because stopping it was unthinkable. On August 15th, everything changed. A black spot appeared on Louis's left leg. The court physicians finally recognized what they were dealing with. Gangrene. The flesh was dying, rotting while the king was still alive. In an era before antibiotics, before modern surgical techniques, gangrene was a death sentence. Everyone knew it. The physicians knew it. And soon Louis knew it too. Here's where the system Louis created became his torture chamber. The king couldn't retreat to private rooms to suffer in peace. The rituals had to continue. Every morning, courtiers would file into his bedroom for the lever. They would watch as servants dressed a king whose leg was literally decomposing. They would maintain their court faces, their practiced expressions of respect and deference, while the smell of rotting flesh began to permeate the royal apartments. Georges Maruchal was the court's chief surgeon. He was 57 years old and had performed countless operations in his career. When he examined the king's leg, he knew exactly what needed to be done. Amputation. Immediate amputation was the only possible treatment for gangrene. Cut off the infected limb before the rot spread to the rest of the body. It was brutal. It was dangerous. The survival rate for amputations in 1715 was maybe 20% at best, but it was the only chance. Marischal didn't recommend it, neither did Fagan, because here's the thing about being the king's physician in an absolute monarchy. Your job isn't to provide the best medical care. Your job is to not displease the king, suggesting that you need to cut off the royal leg. That's displeasing, so instead they tried everything else. More bloodletting, herbal poultices, prayer, lots of prayer. The Duke of Saint-Simon, who was at Versailles throughout this period, later wrote in his memoirs about the impossible situation the court found itself in. Everyone could see the king was dying. Everyone could smell the decay. But no one could acknowledge it openly because the system didn't allow for royal weakness. The machine of Versailles required that the king be the king right up until the moment he stopped being alive. By August 24th, Louis was running a high fever. The gangrene was spreading, his leg was swollen, discolored, and according to Saint-Simon's account, producing a smell so foul that servants began volunteering for any duty that would take them away from the royal apartments. But the lever still happened every morning. Courtiers still filed in to watch the king's rising ceremony. They just did it while breathing through perfumed handkerchiefs. Louis XIV knew he was dying. He'd been a king for 72 years. He understood what gangrene meant. On August 25th, he called for his great-grandson, the 5-year-old Louis XV, who would inherit the throne. In front of the assembled court, he gave the child advice about ruling. And here's a detail that reveals everything about Louis's awareness of his situation. When he dismissed most of the courtiers that day, he didn't say au revoir, the standard French goodbye. He said adieu, the permanent goodbye. The goodbye you use when you know you'll never see someone again. The courtiers understood immediately what that meant. The king knew he was dying. But still, the machine kept running, grinding forward, because that's what the system demanded. And Louis, the man who had built this machine, was trapped inside it. August 26, 1715. Louis XIV had been suffering with gangrenous leg for 11 days. The black rot had spread from a small spot to cover most of his lower leg. His fever was climbing, and the court physicians finally decided to try something more aggressive than bloodletting and prayer. They brought out the cauterizing irons, red-hot metal instruments designed to burn away infected flesh. The theory was that extreme heat could stop the spread of gangrene by creating a barrier of seared tissue. In practice, it was medieval torture applied to a dying king, and it had to be done in front of witnesses because everything involving the king's body was a public event. Georges Marischal heated the irons himself. Court records don't tell us exactly who was present in the room, but we know from the system of Versailles that the king's physician Fagan would have been there, along with select high-ranking nobles. The Marquis de Dangeau's journal entry for that day is brief, noting only that extraordinary measures were attempted. Saint-Simon's later account is more direct. The king, he wrote, endured the procedure with remarkable composure, barely crying out despite the agony. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. This wasn't a last resort emergency surgery. This was a performance. Louis XIV, even while having his rotting flesh burned away, had to maintain his role as the king. Royal dignity demanded that he show no weakness, express no complaint that might suggest he was anything less than the absolute monarch he'd claimed to be for 7 decades. The system he'd created had become so powerful that it controlled even how he was allowed to suffer. The cauterization didn't work. Of course it didn't work. By this point, the infection had spread too far for surface treatments to matter. But the physicians couldn't admit failure because admitting the king was beyond saving would mean acknowledging that royal power had limits. So they kept trying. More poultices, more bloodletting, more prayers. Meanwhile, the daily rituals of Versailles continued like clockwork. Every morning, the lever ceremony still took place. Courtiers would gather in the king's bedchamber at the appointed hour. The doors would open, and they would enter a room that, according to multiple contemporary accounts, smelled overwhelmingly of decay. Saint-Simon specifically mentions in his memoirs that the odor was detectable from several rooms away. Courtiers began carrying strongly perfumed handkerchiefs, ostensibly for fashion, actually for survival. Think about what this means. Dozens of nobles, dressed in their elaborate court costumes, would file into a room where a 76-year-old man lay dying of gangrene. They would stand in their prescribed positions according to rank. They would watch as servants dressed the king, carefully avoiding his rotting leg. They would maintain their expressions of respect and deference, and they would pretend that everything was absolutely normal, because that's what the system demanded. The machine of Versailles didn't have a protocol for royal weakness. It didn't have a procedure for the king being unable to perform his role. So it simply pretended the problem didn't exist and forced everyone to participate in the pretense. Louis understood exactly what was happening. He'd designed this system. He knew that showing weakness would undermine the entire structure of absolute monarchy that he'd spent his life building. So even as his body was literally decomposing, he continued to play the role. When courtiers approached his bed, he greeted them with the same formal courtesy he'd always shown. When he gave orders, he maintained the same tone of absolute authority. The man was dying, but the king had to remain perfect until the very end. On August 28th, Louis summoned various members of the court for private audiences, not private in the modern sense. Even these private meetings included multiple witnesses, because royal privacy didn't exist at Versailles, but they were more intimate than the full court ceremonies. He spoke with Madame de Maintenon, his secret wife of over 30 years. He gave instructions to his nephew, the Duke of Orleans, who would serve as regent for the 5-year-old Louis XV. He said his farewells to key officials and servants. These weren't dramatic deathbed scenes. Louis was still lucid, still in control of his faculties even as his body failed. That made it worse in a way. He was fully aware of his deterioration, fully aware that he was dying slowly, publicly, according to a schedule dictated by the system he'd created. Every conversation had witnesses. Every word was noted in journals and memoirs. Even his death was being documented as a court spectacle. By August 30th, Louis was in constant pain. The gangrene had spread beyond his leg. Modern medical analysis of the historical accounts suggests the infection had entered his bloodstream, causing sepsis. His fever was dangerously high. He was drifting in and out of delirium. But still, the lever ceremony happened. Still, courtiers filed in to watch their king's public disintegration. St. Simon's account of the final days emphasizes the grotesque contrast between the elaborate rituals and the medical horror unfolding in the king's bedroom, the same room where Louis had once held court, where he'd made decisions that shaped European politics, where he'd performed the role of absolute monarch for decades, had become a chamber of slow decay, and the courtiers who'd spent their lives competing for the privilege of attending the king now had to steel themselves just to enter the room. The machine of Versailles was still running, but its center was rotting away, and everyone could see it happening. September 1st, 1715, started like every other day at Versailles. The courtiers gathered for the lever ceremony at 8:30 in the morning. They filed into the king's bedchamber in their prescribed order. But this time, something was different. Louis XIV had stopped responding. He'd been conscious, lucid even, up until the previous evening. The Duke of St. Simon records that on the night of August 31st, Louis had given his final instructions to the assembled court. He'd maintained his composure, his royal dignity, right up until the moment he slipped into unconsciousness. And then, around 8:15 in the morning of September 1st, 72 years after he'd inherited the throne as a child, Louis XIV died. The death itself was almost anticlimactic. After days of public agony, of witness deterioration, of elaborate medical procedures that accomplished nothing, the king simply stopped breathing. There was no dramatic final speech, no grand gesture. The machine of Versailles had required him to perform his role until the absolute end, and when he could no longer perform, he died. The reaction from the court was immediate and revealing. St. Simon, who was present at Versailles that day, describes what happened next with remarkable bluntness in his memoirs. The moment Louis died, the entire atmosphere of the palace changed. Courtiers who'd been maintaining solemn expressions for weeks suddenly relaxed. People who'd been speaking in hushed, respectful tones began talking normally. The oppressive weight of attending a dying king, of performing grief and concern for weeks on end, lifted instantly. Here's the part that really shows how the system worked. Before Louis's body had even cooled, the court had already shifted its focus to the new king. The 5-year-old Louis XV became the center of attention. His uncle, the Duke of Orleans, immediately began asserting his role as regent. The political maneuvering, the competition for influence, the entire machinery of court politics simply recalibrated around a new center. The Sun King was dead, and Versailles needed a new son, but the system still demanded one final performance. Louis's body had to be dealt with according to elaborate royal protocol. An autopsy was performed that same afternoon. The royal physicians, including Fagin and Marechal, examined the body they'd failed to save. Their official report, preserved in royal archives, describes what they found. The gangrene had spread throughout the leg and into the lower abdomen. Internal organs showed signs of advanced decay. The sepsis had been total and catastrophic. Here's a detail that the official reports mention almost casually. The body had already begun decomposing at an accelerated rate. The internal rot from the gangrene had created conditions where normal preservation was becoming difficult. The physicians noted this as a medical observation, but it had practical implications. Royal bodies were supposed to lie in state for elaborate funeral ceremonies. But Louis's body was decomposing so rapidly that standard embalming procedures weren't working properly. They tried anyway. Of course, the system demanded it. Louis XIV had spent 72 years building an image of royal perfection and eternal glory. His funeral had to match that image, regardless of the medical realities. So the embalmers did their work, using the techniques available in 1715, preserving the body, preparing it for display, making sure that even in death the king looked like a king. It didn't work as well as they'd hoped. Multiple accounts from the period mentioned that the funeral preparations were rushed and that there were difficulties with preservation. The same body that had been the physical center of the most elaborate court system in Europe was now actively working against the posthumous rituals that system demanded. The funeral itself took place on September 9th at the Royal Basilica of St. Denis, traditional burial place of French kings. It was appropriately elaborate. Thousands attended. The ceremony followed centuries of royal tradition. But those who got close to the coffin reportedly noticed something off. Despite all the embalming efforts, despite the elaborate preparations, there was still a faint smell of decay. Even in death, Louis couldn't escape the system he'd created. He'd designed Versailles to make every aspect of royal life a public spectacle. So his death became a public spectacle too. His physical decay became a matter of court observation and documentation. His funeral became another performance, another ritual, another demonstration of how the machine of Versailles processed everything, even mortality, into elaborate ceremony. But here's the irony that nobody at the funeral could have predicted. The Duke of Orleans, now regent, immediately began dismantling parts of the system Louis had built. The rigid court etiquette loosened. The obsessive control over noble behavior relaxed. The machine that had consumed Louis's entire life and controlled even his death started breaking down within weeks of his burial. The courtiers who'd spent decades competing for the privilege of watching the king get dressed, who'd endured the smell of gangrenous decay rather than miss a lever ceremony, who'd performed loyalty and devotion for 72 years, they all adapted remarkably quickly to a new system because that's what courtiers do. They adapt to power, wherever it is, however it manifests. Louis XIV had created Versailles to ensure that he remained the absolute center of power until his last breath. He succeeded, but the cost was that he had to remain the center even when that meant dying slowly, publicly, in a room full of witnesses who were documenting every detail of his decay for posterity. The system worked exactly as designed, right up until it killed him according to its own elaborate rules. The autopsy report of Louis XIV reveals something medical professionals today find genuinely shocking. The gangrene hadn't just killed the king. It had essentially been consuming him from the inside for weeks before his death. The physicians who examined his body found extensive internal decay that had spread far beyond the visible infection in his leg. His intestines showed signs of deterioration. His organs were compromised. The sepsis had been total. But here's what makes the medical documentation so disturbing. These same physicians, Fagan and Marochal, had been watching this progression in real time. They'd known for weeks that the king was dying. They'd known that the treatments they were applying, the bloodletting, the poultices, the cauterization, were accomplishing nothing. And they'd continued anyway because the system demanded that they'd be seen doing something, anything, rather than admitting that the king was beyond saving. Modern medical analysis of the historical records suggests that if Marochal had performed an immediate amputation when the gangrene first appeared on August 15th, Louis might have had a 20% chance of survival. Not great odds, but possible. By the time they attempted the cauterization on August 26th, it was already too late. The infection had spread to his bloodstream. At that point, nothing available in 18th century medicine could have saved him. So why didn't they try the amputation immediately? Because suggesting that you need to cut off the king's leg is tantamount to saying the king is mortal, vulnerable, human, and the entire system of absolute monarchy that Louis had built depended on the fiction that the king was something more than human. The physicians were trapped in the same machine as everyone else. They couldn't provide the best medical care because providing the best medical care would have required acknowledging truths the system couldn't tolerate. The funeral ceremonies lasted for days, but they couldn't hide certain uncomfortable facts. Multiple contemporary accounts mention that despite the elaborate embalming procedures, Louis's body continued to decompose rapidly. The lead-lined coffin helped contain the problem. But those who participated in moving the body to St. Denis noted the weight, the smell, the difficulty of handling remains that weren't quite as preserved as they should have been. Think about the absurdity of this situation. The most powerful man in Europe, the king who'd ruled longer than almost anyone in history, whose word had been absolute law for 7 decades, couldn't even decay at a normal rate. His body, destroyed by gangrene and sepsis, was decomposing so aggressively that even elaborate preservation techniques struggled to keep up. The physical reality of his mortality was literally overwhelming the ceremonial attempts to deny it. But the truly revealing moment came in the immediate aftermath of the funeral. St. Simon's memoirs describe how the court atmosphere changed almost overnight. The oppressive formality that had characterized Versailles under Louis XIV began to dissolve. The Duke of Orleans, as regent for the 5-year-old Louis XV, immediately started relaxing some of the more rigid protocols. Courtiers who'd spent years maintaining perfect decorum began acting like normal human beings again. It wasn't that people had hated Louis XIV. Many courtiers had genuinely respected him, even loved him in their way. But the system he'd created was exhausting. The constant performance, the perpetual surveillance, the absolute requirement that every moment be a public ritual, it had worn everyone down. When Louis died, it wasn't just a king who was buried at St. Denis. It was an entire way of life that people were relieved to see end. Here's the ultimate irony. Louis XIV had spent his entire reign building a system designed to concentrate all power in the royal person. He'd created Versailles specifically to keep the nobility under his direct observation and control. He'd established rituals and protocols meant to emphasize the king's central importance to everything. And it worked. For 72 years it worked brilliantly. But that system required a king capable of performing the role, It required someone physically and mentally able to be the center of constant attention, to make every bodily function a public ceremony, to never show weakness or vulnerability. Louis had played that role his entire life. And when his body finally failed, when the gangrene made it impossible to continue the performance, the system had no mechanism for graceful degradation. It just kept running, grinding away, forcing a dying man to maintain royal dignity while his leg rotted off. The courtiers who'd attended the lever ceremonies during Louis's final days, who'd stood in rooms reeking of decay and pretended everything was normal, they understood something profound. They'd witnessed the cost of absolute power. Not the cost in political terms or military campaigns or national debt, the human cost. The price of building a system so rigid, so demanding, so utterly focused on maintaining an image that it couldn't allow even death to happen privately. Within a month of Louis's funeral, the court had largely relocated to Paris. The Duke of Orleans preferred the Palais Royal to Versailles. The elaborate daily rituals were simplified or abandoned. The machine that Louis had built began breaking down, not because people wanted to destroy his legacy, but because maintaining it was simply too exhausting. Without Louis's personal force of will driving it forward, the system collapsed under its own weight. 74 years after Louis XIV's death, in 1793, French revolutionaries broke into the royal tombs at Saint-Martinus. They were systematically desecrating the remains of French monarchs, destroying the symbols of royal power, quite literally digging up the past and scattering it to the winds. When they opened Louis XIV's tomb, what they found was telling. The elaborate preservation techniques, the lead-lined coffin, the ceremonial burial, none of it had worked particularly well. The revolutionaries' accounts describe remains that were partially mummified but extensively deteriorated. The same body that had been the center of the most elaborate court system in European history was now just decayed organic matter that could be scattered in a common grave. The Sun King ended up in an unmarked pit with dozens of other monarchs, indistinguishable from the rest. There's a savage poetry to that ending. Louis XIV had spent his entire life and massive portions of France's wealth building Versailles, establishing rituals, creating systems, all designed to emphasize his eternal glory and permanent importance. He'd turned his own body into a public monument, making every aspect of his physical existence a matter of state importance. And in the end, revolutionaries threw his remains in a ditch and moved on to the next tomb. But here's what's genuinely disturbing about Louis XIV's legacy. The system he created didn't just imprison him, it established a template that other European monarchs tried to follow. The elaborate court rituals, the obsessive control over noble behavior, the idea that royal life should be a perpetual public performance. These concepts spread. Other kings built their own smaller versions of Versailles. They established their own rigid protocols, and they all struggled with the same fundamental problem. How do you maintain a system that requires the center to be perfect when human beings are inherently imperfect? Most didn't handle it as well as Louis did. He at least maintained the performance until his body literally couldn't continue. Later monarchs found themselves trapped in systems they'd inherited but didn't have the force of personality to sustain. The machine kept running, but without anyone capable of being its center, it just ground people down uselessly. The medical horror of Louis's final days reveals something crucial about absolute power. When you build a system that denies your humanity, that requires you to be something more than human, you don't actually transcend human limitations. You just ensure that when those limitations inevitably appear, they do so in the most grotesque and public way possible. Louis couldn't admit he was in pain, so he suffered through cauterization in front of witnesses. He couldn't retreat to private rooms to die in peace, so he decomposed in front of his court. Modern historians sometimes debate whether Louis XIV was a great king or a tyrannical narcissist. But that debate misses the point. Louis was successful at exactly what he tried to do. He built a system that concentrated power absolutely in the royal person. He maintained control over the French nobility for 7 decades. He expanded France's borders and influence. He turned Versailles into a symbol of royal authority that defined European culture for generations. The cost was his humanity. Not metaphorically, literally. The system he built required him to surrender every aspect of private human existence. He couldn't dress himself in private, couldn't eat alone, couldn't have unwitnessed conversations or unobserved moments, and when his body began to fail, he couldn't even die privately. The machine he'd created processed even his death into public spectacle and documented ritual. Here's the final irony. Versailles still stands. Millions of tourists visit it every year, walking through the Hall of Mirrors, touring the elaborately decorated rooms, marveling at the gardens. The physical monument Louis built has achieved a kind of immortality. But Louis himself, his remains were scattered by revolutionaries and lost. The man who tried to build eternal glory through absolute power and elaborate systems achieved lasting fame for the building but personal obliteration. The system that demanded he die publicly, that turned his final weeks into a documented horror show, that forced him to maintain royal dignity while his body rotted, that system outlasted him by less than a century. The French Revolution destroyed it completely. All that suffering, all that sacrifice of privacy and humanity, All those elaborate rituals and rigid protocols, they all proved temporary. The only permanent thing was the palace itself, now a museum where people pay admission to gawk at the cage Louis built for himself. So there you have it. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the absolute monarch who ruled longer than almost anyone in European history. He built the most elaborate system of royal control ever designed. He maintained absolute power for 72 years. He created Versailles as a monument to eternal glory. And when his body finally failed, when gangrene turned his leg into rotting flesh, the system he'd created wouldn't even let him suffer in private. He died according to protocol, decomposed according to schedule, and was buried with elaborate ceremony that couldn't hide the smell of decay. The machine worked exactly as designed, right up until it killed him. And then, less than a century later, revolutionaries threw his remains in a pit and destroyed the system he'd spent his life building. Absolute power proved absolutely temporary, and the man who claimed to be the state ended up as scattered bones in an unmarked grave, while tourists pay to tour his empty palace.